Hello and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's episode, I'm talking to the phenomenal Shahd Alshammari. Shahd is a Kuwaiti-Palestinian author and academic. She's the author of Notes on the Flesh and Head Above Water, which was published by Neem Press in 2022. Shahd teaches literature and has written numerous stories and creative nonfiction. Her research areas include illness narratives and disability studies. Thank you so much, Shahd. It's so great to speak to you today.
Thank you for having me here, Sami. I'm really excited to be talking to you.
So I read your memoir, Head Above Water, fairly recently, and I absolutely loved it. I felt like it was so gentle, so honest, so raw. And obviously the focus of it is your experience with MS. So can you introduce your memoir, especially for anyone listening that may not have read it?
So Head Above Water, Reflections on Illness, is an illness narrative. An illness narrative is a narrative that takes you through how illness can interrupt a life. And basically, it looks at my experience with multiple sclerosis, MS, which is a neurological illness that affects a lot of young people. Interestingly enough, it's between the ages of 20 to 40 usually, and affects a lot of women more than men. So I've been diagnosed with MS at the age of 18, and at a very young age, at an age where you think you're very invincible, you think nothing can hurt you at that age. And so I had this life interruption, which is exactly what an illness narrative does. Years later, I decided to write about that experience. Not just my experience with illness, but because I realized that a lot of people actually have no idea what MS is, or if they do, they have a lot of myths and stereotypes surrounding it. And as someone who's in love with words and literature, I found that, what better way than to kind of write a very vulnerable and open sort of meditation on what it means to be alive and in a different body, whatever that difference is, whatever that different experience of being in this specific body, Arab, Muslim, woman, disabled, non-disabled. The idea is, for me, the body is worth exploring. And I think for a lot of people who don't take much time to think about the body, example, if you've never been seriously ill, or you haven't, experienced a significant other's illness, then you don't think about the body much. But I think the body is something we really need to think about in literature, in media, in films that we see. I think we place a lot of emphasis on the mind and on intellectual abilities and, how we can, intellectualize and philosophize everything, but not much about what it really means to be navigating the world with this body that you have. And that's what Head Above Water attempts to do. I'm really reflecting on what it means to be alive and in the sort of body that I have, but also other women have. There's a lot of women circles in the book, a lot of female friendships. There's a lot of maternal spaces. There's all of these different ideas that I'm trying to explore. So while we are saying it is a memoir, it is also a reflection that I think a lot of readers would probably be able to connect to. It is meant to be sort of like a heart-to-heart conversation that we have with each other, author and reader.
And I think a heart-to-heart connection is a really beautiful way to describe, and really accurate way to describe the book as well. Because when I was reading it, almost within the first page, I was like, whoa, I was not prepared for the depth of this book. And I know that you write poetry, and I think that really comes across. And I didn't realize until after I'd read it that you do write poetry. And then I was just sat there thinking, wow, that makes complete sense. Because it felt like, yeah, of course she writes poetry. Like, it's so lyrical, your writing is so lyrical. And I think because it's so deep, we have no choice but to really, really think very deeply about the things that you write about, and to somehow put ourselves in your shoes, although it is somewhat impossible, but to really get a deep understanding of what MS is and how it affects you and how it affects so many around the world as well. Because like you said, I think a lot of people have misconceptions, or we don't know, like we have a rough idea of what it is, but we don't really know what it is, and we have no idea like actually how deeply disruptive, as you said, it is. And actually you refer to it in your book as a ghost that attacks your body, and I think this is talking about the invisibility of it, because you're not necessarily using a wheelchair or visibly disabled. And that, I think, with MS, and there are many other forms of invisible disabilities, and I think now we're seeing a little bit of a narrative shift where I've seen people, especially around COVID, where they'd be wearing a badge that says that they don't need to wear a mask, and then there'll be an announcement saying, oh, please be aware that not all disabilities are visible. But how has that, the fact that MS is so disruptive in your life, but it's so invisible as well to many people, how has that affected you? And also, how did that seep into the relation with the diagnosis and how you decided to write about it?
So I think, like you said, Samia, it's really interesting. With invisible disability, we never really think about it. And there's a lot of stereotypes, and, even with depression or anxiety, it's something that you don't necessarily see. And yet there's a lot of misconceptions and a lot of stigma surrounding mental illness in general. And the same thing with invisible disabilities, I think. So it's something I never thought about. And again, most people who are non-disabled tend to ignore or not really think about. But having actually, to navigate between looking completely non-disabled, not using a wheelchair or a cane, and then the next day showing up to class or, anywhere really with a cane or on a wheelchair would be shocking for a lot of people. And that's when I started realizing that, people really want to be able to put you in a specific box. And again, this is not theoretical. This is really, that example of what it means to be alive. People need to see you in a certain way. So seeing me as disabled and then as non-disabled was pretty confusing to a lot of people. And that's where the stigma comes in. Then you must be pretending. Then, why are you using a cane today but not tomorrow? Are you being a drama queen? And all sorts of stigmatizing, negative, really negative and harmful, violent words even. And as someone who's quite sort of in tune with what people say, words again, I start thinking about where those words really come from. Why are they so harmful? And how can we begin to change that narrative? And you're absolutely right. I'm kind of amazed that it has started to change with COVID and with long COVID now. A lot of people now understand what chronic fatigue is all about, because with long COVID, people are now describing these experiences as valid experiences of chronic fatigue. They can't go to work, they can't come to class, and all of a sudden we take it seriously when for hundreds of years, a lot of people have been saying, chronic fatigue is disabling. It is a thing. It's not just all in my head. And there's been this kind of really disbelief more than anything, and invalidating these experiences. So it's quite a difficult position to be in. And again, also as a woman, there's always this idea of are you exaggerating? And of course, we know that medical practitioners don't really believe women. There's quite a lot of stigma attached to all of these experiences. And again, you've read the book, but for people listening, once you read the book, you realize it's not just about illness. It's not just about MS. It's really about how many times women are not believed for what they say they feel, or what they say is actually going on with them. There's a power dynamic, constant one, of trying to shift your narrative. And so what Head Above Water does is try to say, let me tell the story as it is, rather than having you, tell it for me, or kind of censor it for me, or shift it in a way that makes sense to you, for example, non-disabled audience, or to the patriarchy. It's quite a lot of stuff in there that really felt quite violent to me throughout all these years, and I felt it was time to talk about it. Again, not just for me, but for so many people around me, so many women, so many friends, so many students, so many disabled individuals that I've become really good friends with. The general realization was this is not a topic that you get to read about or that you actually get to hear about in a very authentic way.
Absolutely. And I think as well, you talked about this idea of how people want to fit things into boxes, and I think
Yeah.
that's such a good and visual way of talking about it. And you write so much in the book about how actually MS is so random, and I think you use the word random as well, like
Yeah.
it's so different day to day, season to season, and how, as you said, one day you can be completely fine, or you'll walk into class teaching, you won't need a cane, you won't need a wheelchair, but the next day you can't get out of bed. And that kind of having that understanding of disability is really important. And I think we are getting that understanding a little bit with mental health, because
Yeah.
we understand that people have highs and lows, especially with mental health, and there are days where you're okay and there are days that you are not. But for some reason, when it comes to physical disability, we have, or generally people have, a different perception, because I
Absolutely.
guess it feels like you have a body that doesn't change day to day, whereas we have this understanding that our mind changes and our feelings changes, but our body is kind of static. It doesn't really
Yeah.
change day to day. But
Yeah.
that's not true with the case of MS, right? So
Absolutely.
I think it was really great, and I'm so glad that you've told your story, and you've done it so beautifully. And actually, you say, I picked out this quote that I thought was so beautiful. You said, "Those who tell stories tell them as they occupy more than one space, reflecting on a past, speaking in the present moment, and anticipating a future." And I thought that was so powerful, because it's true, right? If we're writing something today, we were probably writing about yesterday in
Yeah.
hopes of tomorrow. So tell me a little bit, how was that the process of writing your story? What was it like for you? Were you able to recall things with clarity? Do you feel like maybe your analysis now of what happened when you were younger, is it different? Let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, sure, of course. So it's really interesting when you're writing about your personal experiences or your life. So I actually kept a blog for about 10 years, and that the blog is where I documented sort of day-to-day experiences, and that's how I connected with a wide readership. It was all over the world, and people were reading this blog because I was writing about, women's bodies and experiences. I was using my experience, but also kind of questioning all of this stigma towards disabled women, and this fascination with perfect bodies and so on. So it started off with this blog. And back then, the blog actually can help me connect to what people really wanted to know. So people were commenting, saying things like, I never thought about the body. I always think that, as human beings, Allah has made us, really, really better than other creatures, because we have the brain, we have this privilege of having a brain, but we don't really think about what happens to broken bodies, or what happens to when the mind breaks. We don't think about that. We're always in the state of, we are perfect creatures and strive for perfection. So I kept kind of, listening, and not just writing, but listening to people's questions, people's comments throughout these years of writing on the blog. And then I started keeping also diaries. And that's when journaling actually became a huge part of my life. Again, as somebody who loves words, I was really, really convinced that, I had to keep track of everything. With MS, you start losing track of day-to-day things. Like, for example, you'd forget the the word that you're looking for. You'd call a cup a chair. So there's a lot of cognition difficulties that arise, and they're also quite random. Doesn't mean everybody with MS has these symptoms, but I was starting to kind of have these cognitive difficulties and these memory lapses, and that's why I kind of held on even more to the idea of journaling and to the idea of really, really kind of tracking, not just my life, but the progress of where things were at for me. I didn't do that with the aim of actually one day writing a narrative about MS, but this was just more kind of like for my own awareness of what's actually happening in the body. And I always say this to my friends and to my students. I think there's a lot of benefit to narrative writing and to journaling in general. I think a lot of us write with an idea that I want to publish, but not many of us kind of keep these journals and these diary entries anymore. And journaling was really, I think, the reason that I managed to keep it all together, and kind of anticipate, to requote that quote, to anticipate a future that would somehow end up being better than the precise moment I was living in. And with memoir writing, with narrative nonfiction, there's always this sense that the writer is telling it as it happened to them in their perception. Does not mean it is actually exactly the way it happened. And if we claim that, then we're not telling the truth, we're lying, because your brain will definitely, your mind will definitely change the narrative. You think it happened this way, but there are some gaps that you can't actually recollect. Even if you've managed to document it word for word, you can barely capture that emotion. You can't really relive an emotion. And so it's a really hard process, but I kind of allowed myself that, or I kind of gave myself that freedom in recognizing that, again, it doesn't have to be a perfect recalling of events. And I think we expect that from ourselves, and we expect that from writers of nonfiction, to be 100% factual, to be 100% accurate, which is a lot of pressure that I feel is very unrealistic, not just with MS, but with us in general. When we think about our past and we try to narrate that, there has to be some gap. And allowing that is really what brought the narrative to kind of the way it is written. It's a reflection at the end of the day, and these reflections are kind of meditative. And if you meditate, that sometimes you'll go from one image to another, and it doesn't always make sense. It's not always a full-on narrative. So
yeah, that's really really powerful. And you do in the book as well, you talk about this distortion of memory. And I think especially like if you're experiencing some cognitive issues that affect memory, obviously, like that's one side of it, but generally as well, just with time and with age, we think about things differently, and we have this distortion. And I love what you just said, that we can't actually relive a moment even if we recorded it word for word. And even now with all the technology, like even if it's filmed, we can't relive that moment. And so how can we expect it to be absolutely clear or 100% accurate of what happened? But that's great, you journaled. And I can imagine at the time that it was also like therapeutic and helpful to you in many other ways as well.
Absolutely. And it was before the whole, narrative therapy and journaling became sort of a hype. I've realized this in the past few years. There's a lot of stuff like on Instagram and social media about, benefits of journaling, narrative therapy as healing and therapeutic. And at the time, I didn't really think about all of that. I just wanted a place where I could safely express, how I was feeling. Especially again being so young, and having friends who didn't understand what disability was all about, feeling quite lonely and isolated. I think that's where I really turned to writing and to stories to kind of really keep me alive. That's how it started.
Yeah, great. So one of the things that you write, well, that I took away from the book, is just this sort of depth and loss to identity, and your identity in particular. And so we have Shahd Alshammari, who is a woman working in academia, which is a heavily male dominated field, as are most fields let's
Yeah.
be honest, right? As
Yeah.
most fields.
Yeah.
Um, but you are also living in a very patriarchal society in Kuwait.
Yeah.
You have a disability that most people in society don't know about, sometimes don't acknowledge it, don't respect it, don't validate it. And you also have a family who are from Palestine,
Yeah.
who were forced to flee and have been unable to return.
Yeah.
So when I was reading it, I was like, oh my goodness, it feels like all these different parts of her identity are being somewhat chipped away or being lost one way or
Yeah.
another. But what was that like for you? And I took it away because obviously you wrote about it, and I felt almost kind of as if we were peeling an onion. It was going from one layer to
Yeah.
the next to the next. We were getting deeper and deeper. But can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think for a lot of immigrant readers who have actually experienced exile and immigration, there's a lot there that we don't think about unless we experience it. And I think there's a lot of intergenerational trauma that comes with the loss of home.
Hmm.
And also then this new having to find this new definition for home, having to kind of assimilate into a different culture, even language has to kind of accommodate the example, you have to accommodate English and so on. There's quite a lot there, and I somehow felt that I could relate that to the body also, because for me the body was my sense of home. It's the closest thing I had to really, really feeling like I belonged. Again, being so young, the body was at that time completely perfect. My body felt like this is home. This is my understanding of myself. And rather than it being a geographical home, it felt like it was completely mine. These are my hands, these are my legs,
Hmm.
these are my eyes, everything that kind of, really, really made sense. Just the way, generally for Palestinians, home makes sense. It still makes sense, even though, they're living in exile and diaspora. So having actually being diagnosed with MS and suddenly not recognizing, my sense of, where am I? Where's my hand going at the moment? Am I picking up the cup, or haven't moved my hand yet? The sense of location was quite distorted. And then there was this kind of loss of the safety of home. This body that felt quite safe in the past was now pretty much unsafe, and I felt exiled from my own body, and I had to sort of kind of make these accommodations, make these adaptations, and try to kind of accept this newfound home, find a new sort of language to deal with this body. And I think that was very much connected to how my grandmother, Palestinian, exiled from Palestine, had to kind of really, really figure out new definitions of home and belonging. We never spoke about the body as a home, or the body as a sense of this is all I have. It was always a geographical nation. But with a lot of, again, reflection on the body, that's when I started realizing that we can experience exile in so many different ways. I had grown up thinking exile was just political, was just geographical, but then I started really realizing that it's everywhere. So yeah.
Wow, that's so powerful. This idea of being exiled from your own body, how
Yeah.
everything felt like it was functioning, you were in fully control, and then all of a sudden you just weren't. And
Yeah.
that is what the immigrant experience or the forced displacement experience is, right? For so many people, they feel completely safe. This is their home. They would never have to leave. Some people have an actual connection to like the soil. They're like, no,
Yeah.
this is mine. Like, and it comes in your book as well. Like we see the struggles of your mom and like the pure heartbreak that she
Yeah.
has, and with being unable to return. And that's so, wow, that's so beautiful, so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think when I was reading a book, I found it so tender. And one of the things that really came out was this concept of vulnerability. And I felt, in writing the book, you were being extremely vulnerable because you were laying everything out and you were putting a narrative out there that we haven't really seen into a world that was probably expecting something different from you, as a Muslim woman living in the Middle East.
Mm.
Like there must have, there would have been different expectations of you, but you you stay true to telling your own story, and you did it with such a grace. But we meet in the book, we meet Yasmin, who is your student, and I believe she's your friend. And it seems like Yasmin is the one that's kind of pushing you to tell your stories, and it kind of opens with that, where she's just like, you need to tell your stories, let's sort through all of this stuff, but let's tell your stories, this is what you're going to do next. And to me, obviously, she is your student, and what came across was this real kind of the vulnerability between teacher and student, because what we usually think of is we think of a power dynamic, but as the teacher, you're the one that has the knowledge, you're the one that sets the curriculum, you mark the papers, they're your students coming to you for help, for guidance, they're dependent on your sometimes your lenient marking or whatever it is. But actually, like, you showed in the book that the relationship between teacher and student can actually be very gentle, very open, very vulnerable. And it goes against so many perceptions that we have of academia, which we think academia is like staunch and rules and systems and kind of tough and maybe a bit boring sometimes. But can we unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. There's no denying that academia is very rigid, and it is very male dominated, and there's, power dynamics everywhere in the way we deal with students and the way that female professors are treated. There's quite a lot there of really a lot of patriarchal concepts, and a lot of dominance, really, of ableism and masculinity. And for someone who's, I try to be very, very much sort of an intersectional feminist in my teaching and in how I deal with my students. I realized that really I kind of wanted to break that barrier between teacher and student, because I really wanted to get to know them on a kind of on an authentic level and on a deeper level. I really believe in these safe zones, these safe spaces where you get to know the person that you're seeing on a day-to-day basis. This is the person that's been teaching me for 3-4 years. That was the case with Yasmin. And we kind of developed this friendship as she became also she grew sort of into her own self, and she became a teacher too. So it's like a circle of connections, and a lot of female support, a lot of women supporting women. I think that's where this all comes from. And I really believe in the power of these really vulnerable moments between people in general, but specifically in academia, because these connections are not they're not really supported. There's this sense of keep the boundaries, and then we never really get to the real heart of things, or to real issues. So we keep this distance, and we keep these this kind of like a facade that we just have to kind of keep up. And that was kind of the reason that I wanted to not just share these conversations, but I also wanted to share this vulnerability, to kind of break that stereotype of this is a perfect professor type individual who has it all together, who has never had to figure it out. And and I know a lot of my students see me that way. They think that this is how it's always been, and I find that that's a very false narrative. And in academia specifically, but also, like you said, in a lot of other jobs, that women have to kind of maintain this image, otherwise we're not taken as seriously and not respected enough, that you don't have a lot to offer, and so on. But I felt I did have something to offer, which was actually being able to embrace, dare I say, that spiritual side of things, that kind of connection between me and the other. And that's where Yasmin functions. She's everyone who's reading the book. She's everybody who's being invited in to just kind of listen with with an open heart, and be able to actually sit in the space of vulnerability without feeling incredibly uncomfortable, which is where we tend to be at most of the time.
Absolutely. And actually, I think we look at academia and we think people are studying really hard, they're writing essays and putting presentations together, they're going to change research and narratives and whatnot. But actually the person that's studying, it is really transformative internally, and because you're opening yourself up to new ideas, you're having, but sometimes by your teacher, your world views challenged. Your some of the ideas that you've been brought up with your entire life, suddenly you start studying at a high level and you're just like, okay, now I don't know anything. And that is that is incredibly, it can make you feel vulnerable. It's really kind of tough. It's a lot. And I haven't even, I haven't done a master's or a PhD, but just from my BA alone, there were times where I was sat in the library thinking, oh my goodness, I don't know what I think anymore. Like, I don't, I had this idea of how I thought society should be formed and what we should be doing. But actually, now that I've read this book and I've read that book and I spoke to that professor, I'm not so sure anymore. And that is huge. And what, as you rightly said, what we need in those cases is to have this safe space and to have also a relationship with our professor that doesn't feel so kind of, brought down by power. I want to feel in some ways you're equal, because we're having a conversation. I want to feel like my opinion matters and is as valid as yours, even though you may be older than me, more experienced and, better in many ways. But in that conversation, I want my opinion to feel valid.
Absolutely. I think that's the idea of this very much. It's really this kind of feminist politics, but also it's like a love politics, that even in teaching there is love. There's it's a giving and receiving kind of transaction that's constantly happening, just like in a podcast. You ask the questions, I answer as best as I can, but you're really listening, so it's a constant transaction. And the listeners listening to your podcast, they're part of the conversation, so it's like a labor of love, and there's almost no boundaries as we speak. And I think that is what really causes real change. And it can be personal change, it could be on a larger level, but really this is where the change actually happens, when there are people who are willing to talk, but there are also people willing to actually listen.
Yeah, you're definitely right. So how long did it take you to write Head Above Water?
I would say about 2 years. With I think the pandemic, or during the pandemic, that's when the book was actually finalized. And also with the pandemic taking place, we were all on lockdown. I think everybody started thinking about health and illness at that point. And I was very much fascinated with the way that became the conversation, and disability and illness became the conversation on social media, and everybody wanted to kind of sort of reflect on this vulnerability of what it means to be alive. And I just thought, okay, then it's really time to get that book out there. And and that's when I was very, very kind of blessed, alhamdulillah, that Neem Tree Press picked up the book, and it received a lot of it actually got a lot of rejections initially. The book was rejected by so many publishers in North America and in Europe. And you're absolutely right. It was mainly because they wanted a specific narrative of what it means to be a Muslim woman. They wanted to see, more of that Muslim experience, with the Muslim experience, not keeping in mind that, there's a lot of other stories to tell. They don't necessarily have to be about, a Muslim woman tries to flee Islamic patriarchal country, ends up blah, blah, blah. And that was the narrative that they were actually hoping to see. I was really kind of shocked that publishers were still thinking in that way.
And that's definitely true. They do still think in that way, because we seem to see one of two kind of narratives around Muslims, and one is that we have somebody that's living in a very, very strict environment, and they're like really struggling and they're really suffering. And then the other side of it is we have someone that's fled. Usually she's or he has disabandoned their religion, they've cut ties with their families, we've got like hijabs flying off, we've got like all kinds of stuff happening.
Absolutely,
and both of these are really harmful perceptions. And of course these are some people's experiences, we're not going to deny that, like everyone has their own experience.
Absolutely,
but to continually push this as the Muslim experience is really hard. Yeah, but Neem Tree Press, they and obviously I know a little bit about them. I know that they're kind of committed to giving a voice to underrepresented voices and
Absolutely.
experiences,
Yeah.
and telling authentic stories. So yeah, I'm glad that went ahead. When you were writing the book, was there anything that you were concerned about?
Yeah, I think the first thing I was really worried about is, how's this book going to be received? As a Muslim author, we're constantly being asked to kind of represent, uh, you know, represent Muslim women and Islam in an accurate way, and there's quite a burden there.
Hmm.
There's also that question of, am I misrepresenting, my culture? Am I misrepresenting people around me? And the book being narrative, nonfiction or a memoir, was actually really scary, because a lot of times I would wonder or worry about, how am I actually representing so and so? How am I representing this person or that? And like I said earlier, I really had to sort of allow myself the notion that, this is not 100% accurate. Even if this is my perception, it's not necessarily 100% accurate. And
Hmm.
so I kind of had to really allow myself to work with that. There's also the fear of, how are readers going to receive the book, having seen, me as, completely put together as this respected professor, and all of a sudden see me in a very vulnerable light. It really did, worry me initially. Even when the book was first published, I got a lot of reception. A lot of readers were commenting, saying things like, I had no idea this was what you were going through. I had no idea that MS could harm you in this way. I'm shocked. So there's a lot of like shock around the narrative when it first came out.
Yeah, and I guess part of that is maybe what you were hoping for was just people to understand or get a better understanding of
Yeah.
MS, because like most people don't really know what it is. But I think also because it is so random, and it is invisible some of the time, yeah, it can be hard. So is that what were you really hoping with
I
regards
think
to the book?
I was really hoping that we would start thinking about other illnesses too, not not
Mm,
not just MS. Because I teach a lot of young people, and I'm around a lot of young people most of the time, and there's so many other things out there that we don't think about, that we don't see enough representation of, like epilepsy, like so many other things, like chronic fatigue syndrome, autoimmune conditions, and there's so much silence around that.
mm,
And I think on some level, I wanted, at least the people around me to start being able to say, so this is my body. These are the accommodations that I need. I'm hoping that you'd understand that. So I was really hoping there would be more conversation around that. And I'm finding that at least I'm receiving some, comments on Instagram, some messages, some people saying, I never thought I would read a story about a Muslim woman living with illness. I
mm.
live with autism, or I'm autistic, and so on. So, and I've never seen representation of that anywhere. So it's been really great, just starting this conversation. And now I'm kind of on the listening end. I'm receiving all of these stories that, people want to share.
Hmm. And obviously, like, we are talking about decades and centuries of
Yeah,
illness being hidden and misunderstood,
yeah,
and the change that comes. I think we have patience. We know that it's going to be slow, but starting the conversation and starting anything is always, I think, the hardest bit. And once it's done, hopefully, we hope that the floodgates will open. But I mean, I think that your book is going to really help facilitate some of these greater conversations, and make strides in how we talk about disability, and how what we really need to do when we think about representation as well. Because I
absolutely.
think generally, like, sometimes our representation of certain issues or certain things can be really lazy,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
there's not enough research or there's not enough understanding. So yeah. And actually, on that, you write in the book, obviously, about weakness, and it comes from, I guess, like physical weakness and other things. And you actually say that those that have a weakness are bearers of the secrets of the universe. And you say Allah places the secrets and the light in those who limp, stutter, and are bent over backwards while the rest stand up. And I thought it was so powerful, because actually, like that's such a nice way of looking at it, that suffering in any way, shape, or form isn't weakness, actually, it's strength. Can we talk about that a little bit?
I think that really comes from, my understanding of pain, as something that we are equipped to handle. I do believe that this has a lot to do with how Allah has, given us the answers already. It's just about trying to find your way to them. And this has been said over and over again. The wound is where the light enters, and so on. So all of these quotes that we see nowadays, but we don't really think about where this originates from. I think with illness and with a different experience really of vulnerability and mortality, you start really recognizing this, how we're just really vulnerable creatures, and you start actually connecting. And I don't think everybody goes there, but for me, I started connecting more to Allah, more to spirituality, more to really recognizing where I am in life and where am I going. It's made me a better human being. I feel I'm a lot more modest than I used to be. A lot more humbled. I'm quite humbled by this experience of being alive, and I'm constantly looking or trying to look beyond the body, or trying to look beyond what I see in front of me. And I think it really kind of has given me this understanding, or this craving to understand what lies beyond the body, and what lies beyond is the soul. And can we really start thinking about that? And I think that's what I mean by with Allah placing these secrets, or the universe placing these secrets into the bodies that are in pain, because I feel there's a deeper understanding that I developed over time, and this was throughout the progression of the disease. I also feel like I've progressed more into something a bit more spiritual, into a bit more peaceful, so to speak.
That's so lovely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah, I mean, really moving, honestly, and I wish you all the very best with it all, and and as limited pain as possible. I think that's what we want for everybody.
Absolutely.
So obviously we hope that you're making strides in facilitating better conversation about disability. But how does it feel for you to be part of that shift in narrative? Because I think we are generally seeing a shift as well, especially in communities where disability is hidden. But your book, no doubt, by those that read it and those that hear about it, are gonna feel moved and gonna have their perceptions changed and their ideas challenged. How does it feel for you, especially as somebody who is still living with this disease and having your life impacted by it every day?
Well, I think for me, it still feels quite mind-blowing, really. And, to be able to come on this podcast, to be able to know that there are people listening, people do want to listen. For the longest time, I had thought, and again, this was also to do with the fact that, publishers did not want to publish, a book about illness and disability from this Muslim experience or this Arab experience. I think for me, I'm still quite in shock with the fact that this is a topic that people want to listen to, and there is a shift, like you said. I wasn't aware that shift was actually there, and I'd seen a lot of ableism around me. And when I was studying in the UK, there was a lot of ableism in academia, and in just even accessibility, in the way buildings were designed, bathrooms were designed, all sorts of things that I think I kind of just sort of accepted that there's a lot of ableism and we're not getting anywhere. And that's how I felt up until the book is actually now falling into, I think, the right hands. And so the people who are reading it are kind of giving me the sense of hope, that the sense of, okay, there is a desire to kind of change, like you said, change the conversation, but also it is affecting people on a more personal level. And so I've had people say things like, my friend has MS, or my sister has epilepsy, and we never talk about it, and so on. And it makes me want to talk more to her. So people are reflecting on their lives and also their significant others. So it's not really about me anymore, which I really love. It's kind of, branching out into dealing with everybody else's reflections on illness, and on life. And that, I think, is a huge kind of blessing, alhamdulillah, that I didn't see coming at all.
I mean, for sure, the world there is still a lot of ableism, and I'm sure still in university buildings, especially because so many of them are so old.
Yeah.
And I think, I guess the thing is that maybe the new things that are coming, maybe there is, and I think there is definitely, an idea of how can we make this more accessible to people that are differently abled or disabled or whatever it may be. And it's slow, isn't it going to be slow again?
Absolutely.
Because we're dealing with literally centuries of living in a certain way with certain ideas. And unfortunately, I think still so many decision makers or people in power are not having their thinking challenged enough yet. Accessing them, I think, is really hard. But the way to do it is I think from the bottom or from the masses.
Absolutely.
So sorry, no, I'm really hopeful.
Well, both. The podcast is quite helpful, being, all about the diversity and, authors that have something to say and not necessarily an audience.
What was one of the greatest challenges you faced when you were actually writing the book?
Trying to figure out, how many books is this going to be? Because there's a lot of information there, and you want to tell the whole story, but you also have a limited number of pages that you want to make sure you fill. Also, dealing with chronic fatigue on a daily basis, it makes it pretty hard to kind of commit to a writing schedule. I think for me, the pandemic was one way that I actually managed to get in a lot of writing done. But I think that was what was pretty helpful. But it was definitely a difficult process. I did stop at a lot of points and kind of return to it later. Reliving certain moments is not always fun. So, I would check in with myself. I would check in with my therapist. I'd make sure that I'm still okay. And so it's a very, not just a vulnerable, but also a kind of risky thing to do when you're writing about something that you haven't necessarily healed from yet. So there was a lot of that kind of like checking in with myself and, is everything okay? And reminding myself that, this is the book that, I really want to push out there. So it was like a very difficult birthing process, I would say.
Yeah, it does. And I think on that healing as well, I mean, I guess the writing the book itself may have been a form of healing, or like understanding and coming to terms with your own experiences, some of the trauma that you've experienced. And I think generally storytelling is so important for that reason, especially when it comes to like intergenerational, multi-generational trauma. Because like when I think about my own life, only when we unpack what happened to people, what happened to ourselves, can we move forward. And so much of the time we're dealing with things, trauma and issues that we don't even realize we're dealing with because we haven't unpacked it, we haven't told those stories. And I do
I think that would be the reflection part. And just kind of reflection, we barely get to reflect on what's happened to us.
Absolutely, yeah. But we don't, and sometimes we don't create those spaces. Life doesn't create those spaces. But also I think because sometimes so much of what people go through was just about survival, right? It's about going from one day to the next. And I'm sure you can relate massively. You don't have time to sit down and think, okay, what I'm going through is really traumatic, because you're just trying to get through it.
Yeah, that's true.
Is there anything that you wish you could have no, let me rephrase that better. Is there anything, what would you say to 18-year-old, 19-year-old Shahd who just recently got her diagnosis?
Yeah, I think that's always the question that, I'm always hoping people would also ask themselves. Like I always ask it to my students, what would you say to 18-year-old you? I think more self-love for sure. I think, we had grown up, and I think a lot of women, I think worldwide, had grown up with this idea of self-love means you're not going to be a good person, you're not going to be a giver, you're going to be a bit more selfish. And I think if I had had more self-love at that time, and I think more self-acceptance and self-care, and allowing myself to sort of accept that there's going to be difference, there's going to be a different life narrative, things are going to be different, rather than feel, ashamed, or rather than have to live with
Mm.
that shame for so long and kind of hold it in the body. I think that would have been an easier journey for sure. And that's why I'm always kind of fascinated with the conversation on self-love today, and how it's all over social media, and self-care, hashtag self-care. It's a new thing that everybody talks
Mm.
about. But I don't think back then it wasn't something that I had even thought of or wanted to explore. I didn't think it was something that we could have a piece of that for us. It was more about just giving others, and trying to be a good daughter, trying to be a good sister, blah blah blah, but not good to myself. That kind of
Mm. And I guess the thing about self-love is to accept yourself and love yourself in every
yeah.
situation. But I'd like to reflect a little bit on, how do you love yourself when your body is changing, when it's doing things that's making your life difficult, when it's hurting, physically hurting?
Yeah, yeah,
How do you, because I feel like that is an act of resistance, like that is powerful, and it's like, almost like a revolution. But how do you do that? How can we give ourselves love when our bodies, in some ways, they feel like they're failing us, or they're stopping us from doing what we want to do? Yeah, how do you think we can do that?
I think that's where this idea of kind of accepting, kind of like with depression, it's not going to be a day filled with love every day, and it's not
Mm.
going to be a good day every day. But when I do have the good days, I'm even kind of more excited about the good days. So I'll go, I'll go play squash, I'll read a book, I'll watch a movie, I'll do everything I want to do in those days. And so it's kind of like a huge accomplishment, or feels really, really good for somebody who's not living with pain. It'll feel like, yeah, you just watched a movie or you just read a book. But for me, I kind of really, really cherish those. And on days where my body feels like it's being quite horrible, or it's like really betraying me, I just kind of sit with it, and sort of just think, okay, well, tomorrow things might change, or maybe after tomorrow things might change. And I think for me, I kind of really tried to hold on to that sense of hope, which is again easier said than done. But with years of practice and years of also finding other tools. So for me, storytelling again, even just picking up a book, even just reading some poetry, sometimes listening to it, sometimes I can't pick up a book physically. All of these are different tools that really help me stay kind of a more peaceful state of mind. I'm not going to say in a very loving state of mind, but definitely in a more peaceful state of mind. So I think just having all these different tools, and I think I found a toolbox over the years. And I don't think it's something that you just kind of wake up with and you have a toolbox, filled with different ways you can manage, or you can kind of survive and be resilient and blah, blah, blah. I think it takes a lot of reflection, and a lot of figuring out what really helps, and that then you hold on to those tools.
That's so lovely. Developing a toolbox that you can,
Yeah,
that you can take out when
when you
you
need
need
it.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's really great. What are you working on? Anything else at the moment? What can we expect going forwards? What are your hopes?
I think I'd like to write another collection of stories or a novel. So I think I'd like to go back to fiction, just to explore again disability, the same kind of idea, but also with reflecting on different characters and their experiences of
Mm.
disability and mental illness too. So exploring also mental health. I'm really interested in this because I'm reading a lot of fiction and nonfiction, and I don't see much of disability portrayal
Mm.
anywhere. So I'm really hoping that I can kind of change that. So
Yeah.
we'll see, inshallah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're right. There's not nearly enough
Yeah, yeah.
disability portrayal. So yeah, I'm really excited for whatever you work on next. And
Absolutely.
I'm just, again, like, this has been such a pleasure. I absolutely loved Head Above Water, and I hope more people pick it up. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much, Sami. I really hope people pick up Head Above Water, and I hope it does something for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Shahd for her time and such an insightful and warm conversation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow The Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice. And I would really appreciate it if you could rate and review the podcast, as it helps more people find it. Thank you.